She didn't know yet that the man standing alone by the harbor wall would change everything. She only knew that when he turned and looked at her, just for a second, the way strangers do, something in her chest moved that had never moved before. And then he looked away, back at the water, as if she were nothing. As if she were simply part of the scenery of a place like this, which of course she was. She was the waitress. The girl from London who wasn't supposed to be here at all. The one who had arrived 10 days before the greatest race in the world, with a single suitcase, and the quiet, desperate hope that Monaco might be the place where her life finally began. She was Iris Smith, daughter of a man who had wanted a son, daughter of a mother she barely remembered, a girl who had read every book she could find because books, unlike people, never told her she was too much or not enough. Owen Voss didn't know any of that when he looked at her, but Monaco has a way of making people see each other clearly, whether they're ready to or not. Welcome, my dear friends. My name is Marina. I have always been passionate about history and art, and somewhere between my research and my imagination, characters begin to appear. People who feel real to me, even if they never existed. Thanks to AI, I can now illustrate these stories the way I always pictured them, through the painting styles I have loved since I was young. In today's story, we meet Iris Smith, a young woman from London who arrives in Monaco 10 days before the 1969 Grand Prix to work in a VIP hospitality suite. She is not the kind of woman this world was built for, but sometimes the wrong person walks into the right place, and the stars seem to put everything in place, even love. If you are new here and love Monaco, art and history, please consider subscribing. The restaurant was called The Anchor, though it had never been particularly close to water. It sat on a corner in Stepney, East London, between a newsagent that smelled of damp paper and a laundrette whose machines ran until 10 at night. The sign above the door had faded to the point where you had to already know what it said to read it. The tablecloths were white once. The menu hadn't changed since 1961. Iris had worked there for 3 years. She didn't dislike the work. She was good at it, quick, quiet, attentive in the way that good waitresses are, which is to say she understood that most people don't want to be seen while they eat. They want to be served. She kept her uniform clean, her hair pinned back, her opinions to herself. She memorized orders without writing them down, which the older customers appreciated and the younger ones found unsettling. After her shift, she took the number 15 bus to the flat she rented with 2 other girls on Bow Road. One worked in a factory, one in a department store. They got along well enough in the way people do when they share a kitchen, and are each quietly waiting for their real life to begin. On evenings when she wasn't too tired, Iris read history mostly, biographies, travel writing about places she'd never been and some days suspected she never would. She had a particular fondness for books about the Mediterranean, the light, the architecture, the long, unhurried way time seemed to move there. She'd found a second-hand copy of a book about Monaco in a market on Whitechapel Road 2 years earlier and read it 3 times. She couldn't have explained why, exactly. It just felt like somewhere that existed at the opposite end of the universe from Stepney. Her father lived 12 minutes away by bus. She hadn't visited in 4 months. This was, by the standards of their relationship, a period of relative peace. Thomas Smith drank the way some men breathe, steadily, without thinking about it, as though the alternative had never seriously occurred to him. He wasn't violent in the dramatic way that makes for clear stories. He was violent the way cold is violent, gradually, without announcement, until you realize you've gone numb and can't quite remember when it happened. Iris's mother had died when she was 3. A photograph on the mantelpiece showed a young woman with light eyes and a careful smile, standing in a garden that no longer existed. Iris had studied that photograph so many times as a child that she sometimes felt she remembered things that couldn't possibly be memories. The smell of her mother's coat, the specific weight of being carried up a staircase at night. She didn't know if these were real. She kept them anyway. Her father had looked at her, for as long as she could remember, with a particular expression she had eventually learned to name. Not anger, exactly. Disappointment of a very specific kind. The disappointment of a man who had expected something different and never quite forgiven the world for delivering what it did. He had wanted a son. He had said so once, not cruelly but flatly, the way you'd state a preference for tea over coffee. She had been 16. She had never forgotten it. Not because it broke her, though it did, a little, but because it clarified something. It told her that whatever she built, she would have to build alone. She left at 18 with 2 suitcases and did not go back to live there. It was a Tuesday in late April when Danny called her over during the lunch break. Danny Reeves had worked at the Anchor longer than anyone except the owner. He was 34, broad-shouldered, permanently cheerful in a way that should have been irritating but somehow wasn't. He and Iris had been friends since her first week. He'd shown her which tables tipped and which didn't, which regular customers liked to talk, and which would be offended if you tried. She trusted him in the uncomplicated way you trust someone who has never given you a reason not to. He was leaning against the wall by the kitchen door with a look on his face she didn't recognize. "I had a phone call this morning," he said. "From a woman in Monaco." Iris looked at him. "She's organizing a VIP hospitality suite for the Grand Prix. 10 days, starting the first week of May. She needs someone who can work hard, present herself well, and speak English properly." He paused. "I told her I knew someone." The kitchen noise continued behind them. Plates, voices, the clatter of ordinary life. "Why me?" Iris said. Danny shrugged, but not carelessly. "Because you're the best worker I've got and you speak like you've read a book." "Which you have. All of them, near enough." She looked down at the tablecloth she was still holding. Ironed flat, corners folded, the same as every other day. 10 days, she said. 10 days. Return fare paid, accommodation included. Good money, Iris. She thought about the flat on Bow Road. The number 15 bus. The faded sign above the door of the Anchor. The photograph on her father's mantelpiece. And the 12 minutes between her life and his. She thought about a second-hand book about Monaco that she had read 3 times and never told anyone about. "All right," she said. She said it quietly, without drama, the way she did most things. But something shifted underneath the words, small and private, like a window opening in a room that had been closed a long time. Monaco arrived before she expected it to. She had imagined it from the train, reconstructed it from the book she knew almost by heart, from photographs she'd studied in the library on her day off, from the particular quality of light that Mediterranean travel writing always promised, but never quite described accurately. She thought she was prepared. She wasn't. The train came around a curve in the rock, and suddenly there it was. The harbor. The pale buildings stacked against the hillside. The water so blue it looked painted. The whole principality seemed to hang between the mountains and the sea, as though someone had decided that was exactly where it belonged, and nothing had questioned it since. Iris pressed her fingers against the glass and said nothing. Madame Fournier met her at the station. She was a small woman in her late 50s with excellent posture and the kind of efficiency that doesn't announce itself, but simply gets things done. She looked Iris over once, not unkindly, but thoroughly, and appeared to reach a conclusion she kept to herself. "You speak French?" she asked in English. "A little. Enough to be polite." Madame Fournier nodded as though politeness was the correct answer. "The suite is on the circuit side. We have 9 days before the first guests arrive for race week. There is a great deal to do." She said it without complaint, which Iris understood to mean there would be no complaining expected from anyone else either. The accommodation was a small room above a bakery 2 streets back from the harbor. It had a single window that looked out over a narrow alley, a bed with an iron frame, and a shelf with 3 paperback novels left behind by previous occupants. Iris put her suitcase down and stood at the window for a moment, listening. Somewhere below, Someone was already baking. The smell of it came up through the floor. Warm, unhurried, domestic in a way that felt entirely foreign to the glamour outside. She unpacked carefully, hung her 2 good dresses, set her books on the shelf beside the ones already there. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and opened the notebook she had brought from London, already half filled with everything she'd taught herself about this place. The Grimaldi family, the constitutional reforms of 1962, the circuit that wound through the actual streets of the city, Casino Square, the tunnel, the chicane at the waterfront, the history of the race itself, back to 1929. She had written it all down in her small, precise handwriting, not because anyone had asked her to, but because she had learned early that knowledge was the one thing no one could take from you once you had it. She read through her notes until the light outside changed, and then she closed the notebook and went to find the VIP hospitality suite. It was larger than she'd imagined, and less finished than she'd expected. The space occupied a prime position overlooking one of the circuit's most dramatic sections, close enough to feel the vibration of an engine if one passed, Madame Fournier told her, though the cars weren't running yet. Right now, it was a long rectangular room with bare tables, stacked chairs, uncrated glassware, and the particular atmosphere of potential that empty spaces have before the people who will fill them arrive. Iris stood in the middle of it and felt something she recognized from books, but hadn't often experienced herself. She felt useful. There were 2 other girls working the suite. Christine, who was Monegasque, and moved through the principality with the easy confidence of someone born knowing where everything was, and Sylvie, who was French, and said little but worked quickly and without complaint. They regarded Iris with mild curiosity and then got on with things, which suited her perfectly. The first day was fast, arranging, ordering, testing, adjusting. Afternoon sourcing what Madame Fournier required from suppliers around the principality. In the evening, she decided to walk the circuit route on foot, familiarizing herself with corners and barriers. She also walked the harbor front. The yachts were beginning to arrive, large ones, white and silent, moored in a row that lengthened each day. The restaurants along the waterfront filled earlier each evening. The city was warming itself up, Iris thought, getting ready for something it had been doing every year since before she was born. She loved it. She hadn't expected to love it so quickly or so completely. But there it was. The light, the scale of the place, the way wealth and history sat together here without seeming to argue. She walked and looked and memorized and felt, for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She saw him for the first time on the evening of her second day. She had taken to walking the harbor front after dinner. It was the kind of place that asked to be walked, slowly, without destination. The yachts were beginning to arrive, white and silent, moored in a row that grew longer each evening. The light was doing something she had no adequate word for, turning everything gold and rose and improbable, the way Mediterranean light apparently does when it has decided to make a point. She wasn't paying attention to people. She was paying attention to the water, which was perhaps why she almost walked into him. He was standing at the harbor wall with his back to the promenade, both hands resting on the stone, looking at the sea with the focused stillness of someone working something out. She stopped just in time, close enough to have to take a small step back, and the movement must have reached him because he turned. He was tall. Somewhere in his early 40s, dark jacket, no tie. The kind of face that had passed through handsome some years ago and arrived somewhere more interesting on the other side. A face that had been used, Iris thought, for thinking rather than performing. He looked at her without surprise, which itself was slightly surprising. "Sorry," she said, because she was English and it was the word that came first, regardless of fault. He glanced down at the distance between them, a foot, perhaps more, and something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The ghost of one, maybe. The memory of one. "You're nowhere near me," he said. American. Low voice, unhurried. Force of habit. Iris said. He looked at her for a moment in a way she couldn't read. Not unkindly, but steadily, the way people look at things they haven't decided what to make of yet. Then he turned back to the water. She walked on. She didn't look back, though she was aware, in the particular way you are aware of things you're trying not to be aware of, that he didn't move from the wall. The strange feeling in her chest she attributed to the sea air. The newness of the place. The particular emotion of arriving somewhere you've only ever imagined and finding it exceeds what you imagined, which is disorienting in its own quiet way. She was mostly convinced by the time the harbor lights came on behind her. The city was changing. Iris could feel it before she could explain it. Something in the air tightening, the way it does before a storm, except this was the opposite of a storm. The barriers were going up along the circuit roads, orange and white, bolted to the tarmac, with a permanence that said clearly that the city's ordinary business would simply have to wait. Delivery trucks navigated around them with the resigned patience of people who had done this every year and would do it again next year without complaint. The cafes along the waterfront filled earlier each evening. The yachts kept arriving. Iris walked to work each morning feeling the city hum beneath her feet like something waking up. Owen came in on the third day at 9:30. Iris was at the far end of the suite, working through a linen inventory that Madame Fournier needed checked and rechecked before the final order went in. She heard him before she saw him. Or rather, she heard the particular quality of silence that preceded him, the way the room adjusted itself when he entered. Christine became fractionally more deliberate with the glassware. Sylvie straightened without seeming to notice she was doing it. He went directly to the windows overlooking the circuit with Madame Fournier. He stood there and looked out, said something Iris couldn't hear, listened to the answer, asked something else. Then he looked at the room once, briefly, the way you check a watch rather than read it, and left. Christine exhaled quietly from somewhere behind Iris. Iris went back to the linen inventory and said nothing about the harbor wall or the evening light, or the strange feeling in her chest that she had spent 2 days attributing to the sea air. The fourth day, Madame Fournier was out, chasing a supplier who had delivered the wrong quantity of something that mattered. She left Iris in charge with a list of instructions delivered at speed, and the implicit understanding that everything would be handled correctly because there was no alternative. Iris was halfway through the list when Owen appeared at the door. He looked at the room. No Madame Fournier, just Iris with a clipboard, and seemed to reach a brief internal decision. "I had a question about Thursday," he said. "The service schedule." Iris told him what he needed to know, clearly from memory, without consulting the clipboard. He listened the way he appeared to do everything, completely, without the faint impatience that most men in his position carried into rooms like this without noticing. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You've been here 3 days," he said. 4, Iris said. Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile exactly, but the territory just next to one. "Thank you," he said, and left. From across the room, Christine watched the door close and said nothing, which was its own kind of comment. That evening they walked back along the harbor front, shoes in hand because the stone held the warmth of the day in a way that felt almost generous. It was Christine who brought it up. "You know who he is?" she said. Not a question. "You told me his name." "His name is the least of it." Christine looked out at the water. "Owen Voss has been coming here for the Grand Prix for at least 6 years. Something with components, brake systems, parts that end up in the cars without his name on them. But the teams know him. The serious people know him." She paused, choosing her next words with care. "He lost his wife about 10 years ago. He doesn't speak about it. Nobody here knows much beyond that, only that he has been coming to Monaco alone ever since. Same hotel, same table at the same restaurant, every year without fail." Iris listened without interrupting. "Every year," Christine continued, with the faint weariness of someone reporting a pattern they find both predictable and slightly sad. "Some woman decides she will be the one to change that. beautiful women. Confident women. Women who are very good at making themselves impossible to ignore. She glanced sideways at Iris. He is always perfectly courteous. He is never interested. The girls here say he arrived in Monaco already somewhere else. They walked in silence for a while. The harbor lights came on one by one, pulling long gold lines across the water. "It's useful to know," Iris said. Christine smiled at the sea. "Of course it is. I would love to know what you think of Iris so far. Please, leave a comment below." He came in mid-afternoon on the 5th day, during that quiet hour when the morning's work was done and the evening hadn't yet made its demands. Iris was at the window, looking down at the circuit barriers below, thinking about nothing in particular. She heard him come in and stay near the door. A moment passed. "They'll take all of this down the day after the race," she said, without turning. "The barriers, the cables, everything. 48 hours and the streets are back to normal." She paused. "I find that remarkable." When she turned, he was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Attentive in a different way than usual, less like someone assessing a room and more like someone listening to something they weren't expecting to hear. "You've been reading about it," he said. "Since before I came. The history of the race, the circuit, the principality. I wanted to understand what I was walking into." "And do you?" She considered it properly. "The history I understand. The feeling of it I didn't expect." He moved a little further into the room. Not much, just enough to suggest he wasn't in a hurry to leave. "Which feeling?" Iris looked back out at the barriers, the pale buildings stacked against the hillside, the blue strip of water visible between the rooftops. "That it matters," she said. "Not just the race, the place. That it has been here, holding all of this, long before any of us arrived and will keep doing it long after we've gone." She stopped herself, suddenly aware of how much she'd said. "That's not a very practical observation." Owen looked out at the same view for a moment. "No," he said quietly. "It isn't." He stood there a little longer than necessary, and when he finally said goodnight and turned to leave, he paused just briefly at the door, not quite stopping, not quite turning back, before continuing down the corridor. Iris stayed at the window. Outside, the evening light was doing its slow, unhurried work on the rooftops, turning everything it touched a color that had no proper name. She watched it until it faded. She walked home by the long route that night, along the harbor where the yachts sat white and still on the darkening water. She wasn't thinking about anything in particular. She wasn't allowing herself to. But there was something in her chest that hadn't been there before. Light and slightly fragile, the way hope feels when you haven't had much practice with it. The engines arrived before the cars did. Iris heard them from her room above the bakery on the morning of the 6th day. A sound unlike anything she had encountered before. Not loud exactly, or not only loud, but physical. Something that got into the walls and the floor and the base of the sternum and stayed there. She stood at her window for a moment with her coffee going cold in her hand, and felt the sound move through her like weather. By the time she reached the suite, the city had changed pitch entirely. The guests had begun arriving, men in good suits with the particular ease of people who have been rich long enough to stop noticing it, women in silk and dark glasses, voices in 4 languages overlapping across the room. Madame Fournier moved through it all like a quiet current, adjusting, directing, smoothing whatever needed smoothing. Christine and Sylvie worked the room with practiced efficiency. Iris kept up, and then some, moving between tables with the focused calm she had always been good at, reading what each guest needed before they asked for it. It was the kind of work she understood. Not glamorous, but precise. She liked precision. Owen came in late morning with 2 men she didn't recognize. He went to the window, the same one as always, and stood with his back to the room while the other 2 talked. At some point he turned and his eyes found her across the room, not searching, just arriving there, the way eyes do when they've already decided where they're going. She was pouring champagne and didn't stop. He looked back out at the circuit. Later, during a brief lull when the morning guests had gone and the afternoon ones hadn't yet arrived, she was restacking glasses near the bar when she heard him beside her. "You know what you're doing," he said. She glanced at him. "It's my job." "I've seen people do their job in a room like this," he said. "It doesn't usually look like that." She wasn't sure what to say to that, so she said nothing, which seemed to suit him fine. He leaned against the bar with the unhurried ease of a man who had stopped feeling the need to fill silence sometime in his 30s, and for a few minutes they simply existed in the same space without demanding anything of it. "The car that led the first lap," Iris said eventually, looking out at the circuit below. "Rint. He won't hold it." Owen looked at her. "The Lotus has been quick all morning," she said, "but Stuart's been managing his pace. You can see it in the lap times." She paused, aware she might be overstepping. "I've been reading." Something happened at the corner of his mouth. Not quite the smile she'd been beginning to think didn't exist, but close. "You have," he said. He stayed another few minutes and then left, and Iris went back to the glasses, and Christine appeared from nowhere with the expression of someone who has witnessed something and has decided generously to keep it to herself. The 7th day was warmer, the suite fuller, the circuit louder. Iris had found her rhythm in the room by now. She knew which guests liked to be approached and which preferred to be left alone, which conversations were genuine and which were performances, where to be and when. Madame Fournier had stopped checking her work, which was the closest thing to a compliment the woman appeared to offer. Owen was there most of the morning. They spoke twice, briefly, about nothing of consequence, the kind of exchanges that matter precisely because they aren't about anything. She said something dry about the circuit commentary coming through the speakers, and he laughed, just once, quietly, as though slightly surprised by it. She stored the sound of it somewhere private and moved on. It was early afternoon when the man approached her. He was a guest. Belgian, she thought. Or Dutch. Somewhere in his 50s with the broad confidence of someone who had made a great deal of money, and interpreted this as evidence of a great deal more. He had been in the suite since late morning and had looked at Iris several times in the way certain men look at women who are working, as though the fact of her working somehow made her more available rather than less. He called her over with a question about the Saint Devote corner, where it fell on the circuit, what happened there historically. She answered clearly, giving him more than he asked for: the 1955 race, the incidents at that section, the particular challenge it presented to the drivers. He listened with the expression of a man who had stopped caring about the answer some time before she'd finished giving it. "You know a great deal," he said, in a tone that managed to make knowledge sound like an endearing peculiarity rather than a quality. "I read," Iris said pleasantly, and made to leave. "Perhaps you could show me the circuit sometime," he said, "since you know it so well." She was about to answer when Owen appeared at her shoulder. He didn't raise his voice or change his expression. He simply arrived, the way a wall arrives when you don't see it until you're standing in front of it, and said something to the man about a contact they apparently shared and a conversation apparently worth having elsewhere. The man's attention shifted. Within 2 minutes, he had drifted to the other side of the room. Owen didn't look at Iris afterward. He just moved back to where he'd been standing. But she had seen his jaw tighten when he'd crossed the room, and she had seen him move with a kind of purpose that had nothing to do with the contact or the conversation. She went back to work and said nothing about it to anyone. That evening, she sat at her window above the bakery, with the sounds of the circuit dying down below, and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Looked after. She turned the feeling over carefully, examining it from every side the way you examine something fragile, half expecting to find the flaw in it. She couldn't find one, which frightened her slightly more than finding one would have. On the 8th morning, he found her on the terrace during the break between practice sessions. The city had gone briefly quiet. That strange suspended silence between runs when the barriers are still up and the crowds haven't moved, but the noise has simply stopped, and Monaco holds its breath for a moment before the next wave of sound arrives. He came and stood beside her and looked out at the empty circuit below. "There's a cafe," he said, "on the Rue Grimaldi, away from all of this." He didn't look at her when he said it. "If you wanted coffee." Iris looked at the empty track. "All right," she said. The cafe was small and cool, and far enough from the circuit that you could only hear the city rather than the race. They sat at a table near the window, and the coffee arrived without ceremony, and for a while they just talked. Easily, without the careful architecture of people performing conversation. He asked about London, and she told him the honest version, not the worst of it, but not the dressed-up version either. He listened without flinching, which she appreciated. She asked about America, and he described Ohio with the particular mix of affection and clear-eyedness that people have about places they came from, and outgrew, and still somehow carry with them. She told him about the book on Monaco she'd found in Whitechapel Market. He told her about the first race he'd attended here, years ago, standing in the crowd with no passes and no contacts, and no idea that this place would become the fixed point around which a portion of his life would quietly organize itself. It was going well. Better than well. It had the particular quality of a conversation you don't want to end, where the other person keeps saying things that make you want to hear what they'll say next, and the coffee goes cold, and neither of you reaches for it. Then the door opened. He was English, which somehow made it worse. A large man in a pale linen suit, late 50s, with the kind of face that has been pleased with itself for so long, the expression has become structural. He saw Owen and came over immediately, hand extended, already talking. Owen stood slightly and they shook hands and exchanged the shorthand of men who know each other from rooms where serious money is discussed. Then the man turned and looked at Iris. He looked at her the way she had been looked at her entire working life. Not unpleasantly, not with malice, which was almost the worst part. Just with a complete and efficient assessment that took approximately 2 seconds and arrived at a conclusion he didn't bother to hide. "Well," he said, with a smile that had warmth in it the way a stage set has walls. "Owen Voss with a companion. There's something you don't see every year." He said it lightly. The way you say things when you want everyone to understand exactly what you mean while maintaining the right to deny you meant it. Owen said something easy and non-committal. The kind of response that closes a moment without addressing it. The man laughed, clapped him once on the shoulder, said something about dinner later in the week, and moved away toward the bar. The cafe felt different after he'd gone. Iris looked at her coffee cup. Owen sat back down. Neither of them spoke for a moment, and the silence had a different quality now, heavier, like a room after a window has been shut. "I should get back," Iris said. She said it quietly. Without drama, without tears, without any of the things she might have been forgiven for. She simply said it, the way she said most things, and stood up, and left enough money on the table for her coffee, and walked back out into the Monaco afternoon. Owen didn't stop her. That was the part she kept coming back to, later, in her small room above the bakery. Not what the man had said. She had heard variations of that her entire life, and had developed the scar tissue for it. It was that Owen hadn't said anything, that he had sat there with his easy, non-committal response and let the moment pass. She lay on her bed and looked at the ceiling, and told herself she had been a fool. Not for coming here. She would never regret coming here, but for allowing something to take shape in her chest that she had no business allowing. Something light and fragile that had taken less than 10 days to build and approximately 90 seconds to come apart. She knew better. She had always known better. She turned out the light and listened to the city outside, still humming with engines and money and the particular glamour of a place that had no use for girls from Stepney, who thought that reading books was the same as belonging somewhere. It wasn't. It never had been. She went to sleep telling herself she was grateful to know it now rather than later. She was up before the bakery. She lay in the dark for a while, listening to the city finding its feet. A delivery somewhere below. A gull. The distant sound of something mechanical being tested on the circuit before the day officially began. Then she got up, dressed carefully, pinned her hair back with the same precision she brought to everything, and went to work. She had made a decision in the night, and the decision was simple. She was here to do a job. She would do it well, collect what she was owed, and go home. That was all this had ever been, and she had been foolish to allow it to feel like anything else, even privately, even only to herself. The suite was busy from early morning. Qualifying was 2 days away, and the energy in the room had taken on a different quality. Sharper, more focused. The guests leaning into conversations with the intensity of people for whom the racing had stopped being entertainment and become something closer to business. Iris moved through it all with the quiet efficiency that Madame Fournier had stopped commenting on, because it no longer required comment. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. Owen arrived mid-morning. Iris saw him come in and felt nothing, or told herself she felt nothing, which amounted to the same thing for the purposes of getting through a day. She was at the far end of the room when he entered, and she stayed at the far end of the room, attending to things that needed attending to, of which there were always enough if you looked. He found her anyway. Not aggressively, not obviously. He simply moved through the room in the way he always did, and at some point she looked up and he was nearby. "The rent situation this morning," he said. "You were right about Stuart." She looked at him with the pleasant, composed expression she had been using on difficult guests since she was 19. "I'm glad it's been an interesting session," she said. "Can I get you anything?" A beat passed, small and precise as a cut. "No," he said. "Thank you." She nodded and moved away toward a guest who needed nothing in particular, but provided a direction to walk in, and that was enough. Christine watched it happen from across the room, with the careful neutrality of someone who understands that there are situations in which even friendship requires a certain stillness. She didn't say anything to Iris. Not then. The afternoon ran long. The suite emptied in stages. The serious men first, back to the paddock and the timing sheets and the conversations that mattered to them. Then the others gradually, until by early evening only the last few guests remained, finishing bottles that had been opened at noon with the unhurried ease of people who had nowhere to be, that they were in any hurry to reach. Iris cleaned and restacked and prepared the room for the following day, with the methodical focus she had always found useful when other things needed to be kept at a distance. Christine found her in the small back room going through the next day's order. "Go home," Christine said. "I'll finish. I'm nearly done. Iris." Christine said it simply, without weight, and held out her hand for the clipboard. Iris gave it to her. She walked the harbor front because she always walked the harbor front, not because she was looking for anything or hoping to find anything, but because it was the one part of each day that belonged entirely to her. Monaco at night during race week was a different creature from the Monaco she had arrived in 10 days ago. Every restaurant full, every table turned toward the water, music from somewhere she couldn't locate drifting across the harbor. The yachts blazed with light. People moved along the waterfront in the particular way of people who know they are in the right place at the right time and want to inhabit that feeling for as long as possible. Iris found a low wall away from the crowds and sat on it and looked at the water. She allowed herself, because she had earned it, to feel the full weight of things for a few minutes. Not only Owen. Owen was the surface of it, the most recent layer. Underneath was everything else. Her father's voice in the kitchen on an ordinary Tuesday, flat and certain. The number 15 bus. The faded sign above the anchor. The photograph of her mother in a garden that no longer existed. The long patient accumulation of being told, in various ways and by various people, that she was not quite what was needed. She sat with all of it until it had said what it needed to say. Then she looked up at Monaco. The lights, the water, the pale buildings rising against the dark hillside, the whole improbable, beautiful fact of the place. And felt, despite everything, the stubborn, persistent love for it that had been there since she arrived, and that none of the last 24 hours had managed to touch. That was something. That was hers. She stood up and straightened her jacket and walked home. She was done hoping. She had decided. The decision lasted more or less until she turned out the light. But she remade it in the morning, and that was what mattered. The morning arrived loud. Iris was already dressed when the first car went out. She heard it from her room, that sound that was less a sound than a physical fact, moving through the walls and the floor and the air itself. She stood at her window for a moment, with her eyes closed, and let it pass through her. Then she picked up her bag and went to work. Qualifying day had a different texture from the days before it. The same room, the same glasses, the same view. But the people in it had shed something. The performance of the week, the careful sociability, the conversations held at a slight angle to what everyone actually meant. Today, the men leaned over tables with lap sheets and said exactly what they thought, and the room was better for it. Iris moved through it and felt the difference and liked it. This was the thing underneath the glamour. This was what all of it was actually for. Owen was there from early morning. She was aware of him the way you are aware of weather, not looking directly at it, but knowing precisely where it is. She served him coffee at one point without meeting his eyes. He said thank you. She moved on. Stuart's lap came in the early afternoon. Iris was restacking bottles at the back of the room when the timing screens changed and someone said his name, and the room came alive, in that way rooms do when something has happened that everyone recognizes at the same moment. She looked up at the screen and then out at the circuit and felt the number land in her chest. Not just fast, but something beyond fast, something that belonged to a different category of human effort entirely. Even the composed ones let something show. Even the people who had seen this many times. Iris stood at the back of the room with a bottle in each hand and felt her eyes sting unexpectedly and had absolutely no explanation for it. She blinked, put the bottles down, and went back to work. By 5 o'clock, the suite had emptied. The guests had filtered out in the satisfied, gradual way of people whose day had delivered what they came for. The circuits outside were going through their final cooling sounds. Iris was gathering her things when she heard him behind her. She turned with her expression already arranged. Owen looked at it for a moment. The way you look at a door you know is locked. I handled it badly, he said. In the cafe. The way I let that pass. No preamble, no careful construction. Just the words, sitting there plainly between them. I should have said something. I didn't. Iris said nothing. He didn't reach for her response or wait to be absolved. He just said it and left the rest where it was. She looked at him for a long moment. The late light came through the suite windows and lay across the floor in long pale rectangles, and the city outside was beginning its evening sounds, and she thought about the harbor wall on her second night. The almost collision, his voice saying, "You're nowhere near me." "All right," she said. He nodded once. And then, as though the whole thing had been agreed upon without anyone quite deciding it, they walked out of the suite together. Monaco, in the early evening on qualifying day, is a specific kind of beautiful. The crowd still present but softened, the urgency of the afternoon beginning to dissolve into something more human. They walked without a plan and ended up on a narrow terrace above the harbor, one of those elevated spots the principality keeps tucked between its buildings, with a low stone wall and a view that made everything below look like it had been arranged deliberately. They sat on the wall. The sun was going down behind the hills, pulling color across the water in long, unhurried lines. He told her about the first car he had ever actually worked on with his hands. A garage in Columbus, Ohio, an engine that should have been scrapped and wasn't because he was 17 and too stubborn to accept that something was finished before he'd tried everything he could think of. She asked what happened to it. He said it ran. She said of course it did. He looked at her sideways and almost smiled. She told him about the first book that made her feel the world was larger than her street. A library copy, 3 weeks overdue, returned eventually with money she didn't have because she couldn't bring herself to keep it, even though she wanted to. He asked what book. She told him. He was quiet for a moment, and then said he had read it too, years ago, in a waiting room somewhere, and had thought about it afterward for longer than he'd expected. She hadn't anticipated that. It sat between them warmly. She told him about her father. Not the worst of it, but enough. The flatness in his voice. The particular quality of his disappointment, which had never been dramatic but had been constant. The way damp is constant in a house that doesn't get enough light. The morning she left with 2 suitcases, and the feeling that was equal parts terrifying, and the first clean breath she could ever remember taking. Owen listened without shifting, without the discomfort most people couldn't quite hide when she got near the edges of it. "You came a long way," he said. "Stepney to Monaco." She looked at the water. "Literally." "That's not what I meant," he said. She didn't answer, but she felt the words settle somewhere and stay there. The harbor went gold, and then rose, and then a deep blue that had no business being as beautiful as it was. A boat horn somewhere across the water, low and long. The city finding its nighttime voice beneath them, softer than the day, more forgiving. At some point she realized they had been sitting there for 2 hours, and neither of them had looked at the time. She didn't mention it. Neither did he. When they finally walked back down through the narrow streets, the city was fully dark and warm and loud in the pleasant way of a place that knows how to enjoy itself. Their steps fell into the same rhythm. She noticed it and said nothing. At the corner where their ways divided, he stopped and looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Something had been put down that he had been carrying for a long time. She didn't know the full weight of it, but she could see the difference it made in his face. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," Iris said. She walked back to her room with the warm night around her, and didn't try to make sense of any of it. She just let it be there, the way you let something fragile rest in your hands without gripping it. For the first time since she'd arrived, she fell asleep quickly. She was in the suite before anyone else. The city was still dark when she arrived, the circuit barriers casting long shadows under the street lamps, the harbor below flat and silver and perfectly still. She moved through the empty room, setting the last things in place: glasses, bottles, the small details that Madame Fournier had trusted her with from the 3rd day without saying so explicitly, and felt the particular quality of Monaco at that hour, the held breath of it, the sense of a place gathering itself for something it has done many times and treats with the same seriousness regardless. She stood at the window for a moment with her hands resting on the sill. Whatever happened after today, she had had this. Nobody could take the mornings from you. The guests arrived from 10. Champagne before noon, the room filling with voices and anticipation, and the particular electricity of people who have been building toward a single afternoon all week. Outside, the barriers were lined with crowds 4 and 5 deep, the colors and the noise rising steadily as the hour approached. At 2 o'clock, the grid formed below the windows and the suite went briefly, instinctively quiet. 26 cars. The sound they made leaving the grid simultaneously was something Iris had not been prepared for despite everything she had read. It came up through the floor and into her chest, and stayed there, a physical fact rather than a noise. And for a moment, she forgot entirely what she was supposed to be doing, and simply stood at the window with a tray in her hands and her mouth slightly open. Nobody noticed. Everyone else was doing the same thing. Stuart took the lead before Saint-Devote and never gave it back. Iris watched him when she could, between the champagne and the conversations and the constant small demands of a room full of people who needed things, catching glimpses through the windows as the matra came through, blue and precise, lap after lap, with the kind of consistency that looks almost mechanical, until you remember there is a man inside it, making 1,000 decisions a minute. She had read about Stuart before she came. She understood now that reading about him and watching him were entirely different experiences. Hill went out before half-distance. A crash, sudden and final, and a murmur moved through the suite like a wave. Mr. Monaco, 5 times winner here, gone. Iris felt something for the old champion, a stranger she had never met and only read about, and had to keep moving because the glasses needed filling and sentiment was a thing you attended to later. Owen was across the room for most of the race. She was aware of him the way she had been aware of him since the second day. That constant peripheral knowledge of where he was without looking directly. Once, in the noise and the celebration of a fast lap, their eyes met across the room, just for a second. She looked away first. Stuart won with laps to spare. Clean, inevitable, the kind of victory that feels in retrospect like it could never have gone any other way. The suite came apart at the seams, the real reactions coming through now, undisguised. People who had held their composure all week, suddenly allowing themselves the simple pleasure of being delighted. Champagne opened itself seemingly without human intervention. Someone embraced someone else. The circuit below filled with people streaming toward the cars. Iris stood at the edge of it all and felt the beauty of the thing, the whole improbable, beautiful fact of it, and was glad she had been here for it. Whatever else, she was glad for that. The room emptied over the following hour. The farewells went on a long time the way they do after something shared, the reluctance of people who have been briefly alive together in the same room and are not quite ready to stop. Madame Fournier found Iris near the end and took both her hands and held them, and said she had been exceptional, said it plainly, looking directly at her, in a way that required no decoration. Iris thanked her, and meant it, and had to look at the window for a moment afterward. Christine held her for a long time without saying much. When she pulled back, her eyes were slightly bright. "Write to me," she said. "I will," Iris said. She meant that too. When the last guest had gone, she went to the terrace. The dismantling had already begun below, the barriers coming down section by section with a speed and efficiency that seemed almost aggressive. The cables gathered, the timing equipment disappearing into trucks. The crowds were thinning. The circuit that had consumed the entire city for 10 days was being erased in real time, the streets reclaiming themselves piece by piece, and there was something in it that Iris found almost unbearable, and also right. That was the nature of things. You couldn't hold on to the extraordinary. You could only be present for it while it lasted. She heard him behind her and didn't turn. He came and stood beside her, and for a while neither of them said anything. Below, another section of barrier came down. A truck moved slowly along the Rue de la Piscine. The harbor caught the late sun and threw it back at the sky without apology. "Good race," she said. "Yes," he said. A long moment passed, a comfortable one, which itself felt like something. Then Owen turned toward her slightly, and she could feel him choosing his words with the care of a man who has learned that words matter and cannot always be taken back. He said he wasn't good at this. Said it plainly, without apparent embarrassment, as a simple piece of information she ought to have before he continued. He said that since his wife he had not wanted to be good at it, had found it easier and in some ways preferable to remain where he was, which was a place he understood and could manage. He said Monaco every year had been part of that. The same hotel, the same table, the same race, the known quantity of it. Then he looked at her. He said this year had not been the known quantity. He asked her quietly, without theater, if she would consider coming to America with him. Iris looked at the harbor. The yachts were still there, white and unhurried, indifferent to the dismantling going on around them. The pale buildings rose against the hill in the evening light, warm and familiar now, in a way they hadn't been 10 days ago. The narrow streets she had walked every evening, learning them the way you learn something you love, not to possess it, but simply to know it more completely. She had come here with a suitcase and a second-hand book, and the threadbare hope that something might be different. And something had been different. The place had given her that before he had, and she was honest enough with herself to know it. "I'm afraid," she said. Not of him. She wanted that to be clear, and she thought from the way he was listening that it was. "Not of you. Of leaving here." She paused. "I know that sounds—" "No," he said. She looked at him. "It doesn't sound like anything except true," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Below, another barrier section came down with a sound like punctuation. "Could we stay?" she said. "A little longer. Here, before anywhere else." She felt the vulnerability of it sitting in her chest, exposed and slightly ridiculous. "I'm not asking for— I don't mean to suggest that you—" She stopped, tried again. "I just need to know that this is real somewhere I recognize before I carry it somewhere I don't." Owen looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said. Simply, without hesitation, without making her feel that she had asked for too much. Iris looked back at the harbor. The last of the sun was on the water, doing what it always did at this hour. That slow, unhurried transformation that she had watched every evening from this city and never once taken for granted. She didn't know what came next. America, maybe. A life she couldn't picture yet in a place she had never seen. A man she had known for 10 days who had looked at her from the beginning as though she were worth looking at. She didn't know any of it. For the first time in her life that felt less like danger and more like space. They stayed on the terrace as the light went, and the circuit disappeared below them, and Monaco became simply itself again. The harbor, the hills, the warm dark, the city that had been here before all of this, and would be here long after. Neither of them was in any hurry. That is where I will leave Iris and Owen, on a terrace above the harbor, with Monaco returning to itself around them, and everything still open ahead. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing. It is a small gesture that helps this channel more than you might think.